Hi, I'm Dr. Vicky Glasgow, equine nutritionist at Harbro, and today we're going to speak about some of the common feeding issues that we get talked about at this time of year. The first one is how to manage the good doer, so that's your fat horses and ponies, and how to manage them so they don't put on too much weight when the grass is rich and you're having problems with that. The second topic is how to put or keep condition on some horses. Whilst this is normally a problem that you get in the winter time, you can also see it at this time of the year, and particularly older horses and or horses that are competing or working hard. The third issue that we quite often see at this time of year, especially now while the grass is lush and having a bit of a flush, are horses that are a little bit too fizzy and have a little bit too much energy. So we're just going to have a look at how we can help those horses and ponies. And lastly, but not least, some horses and ponies sometimes don't have just quite enough energy for the work that we're wanting them to do. And that will be the last topic that we cover today. Okay, so if we're looking at how to manage the good doer, at this time of year, the biggest problem is that there's such a lot of grass about, and ponies just love grass. So how can we look at managing these ponies to keep them healthy and happy? So there are basically different methods of managing grass, and the more traditional methods tend to be strip grazing, which is where you advance the fence for the ponies every day and they get a little fresh bite of grass. You have to be careful when you're doing that method because you need to make sure you've got a back fence as well and you're moving it at the same time, because while the ponies are munching at the front, do you remember the grass is still growing at the back. Now, some of the more sort of, I suppose, modern ways of managing horses with grass that have come on in the last sort of 10 years or so. The first one is a track system, which, just like it sounds, is a track that goes around the outside of the field that you can set up with electric fencing. As you can see here, it basically, a lot of people call it a racetrack, but what it does is it encourages the ponies to move around to get their feeding, and they're not getting too much grass. You can put hay around the system for them as well. Another system which you can actually use to manage grass for maybe some horses that aren't good doers but just don't need as much grass is a radial system, which, as you can see here, is like it sounds. There's a central area where they can get their water and their hay and their loafing area, but you're able to rotate the paddocks that are around in a radial fashion. So that basically keeps some nice fresh sward for your horses and keeps everybody happy. Another method, if you've got horses that are really struggling with obesity, is actually just remove them from the grass altogether, and you may have to do this for a month or so just to get the condition off. And this is, to do this, you need a grass-free area. So you can set up an all-weather grass-free area quite easily. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can use electric fencing to do it, but it just basically is somewhere where the horses can stay, eat their hay, and not be on the grass. And then lastly, one of the main things, which a lot of people sometimes don't like doing, but which I'm a great advocate of, is using muzzles for your ponies. Now, once you get a horse used to it, they do actually tolerate them very well, and it can reduce their grass intake by up to 75%. So as you can imagine, that is great for something that you're really struggling to keep the condition off. And it allows them to still be out exercising with their friends. And it's actually, I feel, a quite humane way of restricting grass for these types of horses and ponies. So with a good doer, it's really important to make sure they're getting enough forage. Forage is really important. So obviously if you're restricting their grazing, you have to replace that with hay. So how do you give them hay without them overfeeding on hay and then getting fat as a consequence of eating too much hay? So we need to look at ways of restricting the intake of the hay, and there are many ways of doing this. One of which is if you have a big bale of hay out for them, you can actually buy a trickle net, which is a slow feeder type apparatus that you can put over the bale, and it restricts how much they are eating. You can also get the smaller hole nets that you can actually hang up for them, which will also restrict the amount that they are eating. It's always good to try and get later cut hay, because later cut hay tends to be lower in sugar and therefore lower in energy, and is better for your fat types of horses and ponies. The other method, which a lot of people do, and is great if you've got the time and facilities to do it, is soaking hay. So basically try to soak hay for at least 4 hours, preferably up to 12. And what that does is it leaches out all the sugars out of the hay, and therefore means that you can feed more of it and it's a much less energy dense diet for them. So always look at the forage portion of your horses and ponies' diet when you're looking to lose condition from them. So what about bucket feeding for these horses and ponies? It's quite tempting to just actually starve fat horses and ponies to try and get them to lose weight, but in actual fact you can do more harm than good, and they do need some of the bits and mins to actually mobilise fat reserves. So we'd always advocate providing your fat horse and pony with a really good quality vitamin and mineral supplement. This basically just ensures they're getting all their bits and mins and staying healthy. The other thing you can do is you can feed that bits and mins in a handful or two of a low-cal chop, which just slows down the eating and makes them feel like they've had a nice bucket of feed, just like their friends have. And this is just a really good way of feeding them. They don't need any more than that. If your horse and pony is doing decent levels of work and still needing to lose condition, what you can do is replace the vitamin and mineral supplement with a balancer, because then at least you're actually replacing some of the protein reserves that will be used up with the amount of work that they're doing. Another thing to bear in mind is some of the low-cal chops say that they're mineralised, have vitamins and minerals in, but what you have to bear in mind is that if you're relying on it for all your vitamin and minerals for the horse and pony, it actually needs to be fed at really quite high levels. So we're talking about 4 to 5 kilos a day. So unless you're feeding that amount, you still have to top up with vitamins and minerals. So I would suggest that unless you are actually feeding that 4 or 5 kilos a day, which to be fair most people aren't, then you still need to top up with bits and mins. The only other thing that your horse and pony will need, apart from water and forage of course, is salt. Salt licks are great, and they're a good sort of occupier of time for horses and ponies, but it is preferable to put the salt into their bucket feed, because then you're sure that they're getting it. And horses and ponies should be getting 1 to 2 tablespoons of salt a day, and that's just your normal common or garden table salt. So what about these horses and ponies that we do have as well at this time of year that aren't managing to keep condition on? What do we do with them? And it seems to be more of a common problem during the winter, but we can see it at this time of year, particularly in older horses and ponies and or competition horses. Now, as with when you're feeding any horse and looking to adjust its body condition, the most important thing is to look at the forage portion of the diet and make sure it's the best quality forage that you can get for your horse and pony. So totally different from the good doer, what we need to do is look for sort of, I suppose, earlier cut hay or haylage, and make sure that you're genuinely feeding it ad lib, and also that they're getting decent grazing and access to decent grazing. One thing to watch out for is, especially when there's a spring flush, even some of these sort of thinner types of horses and ponies cannot deal with the high sugars in the grass, so you may have to remove them from the grazing as well and give them a good bit of haylage or really good quality hay just to try and keep condition on them. Another thing you can do, especially if you've got stabled horses and ponies that you're trying to keep condition on, if there's an inkling that your hay isn't of the best quality nutritionally and you have to use the hay that you've got, which is the circumstances that most of us find ourselves in, there's a little trick that you can do by using the higher calorie chops. So we're talking about grass chops, alfalfa chops, those types of things. You can actually use that as a partial hay replacer. And what I always tell people to do is get a massive big tub trug that you can buy and stick it inside a tyre so that they can't knock it over. Fill that tub trug with grass and or alfalfa, whichever is your choice, and it can then become a partial hay replacer, and it has got a guaranteed nutritional value. So that's one of the things that you can do. Generally speaking, older horses and ponies, because of their digestive system, and competition horses, because of the amount of work that they're doing, are actually lacking in protein. So it's really important to not only provide energy, but make sure you're providing them with good quality protein. Now this can be provided with a balancer pellet, as long as it's a good balancer pellet with things like linseed or soya mentioned quite high up the label, and a higher spec chop. You can then use things like linseed oil to add extra condition if required. The other thing you can do is use a good quality conditioning cube or mix for your horse pony, especially if it's a competition animal, because it will give them everything they need with a good quality protein, and it's easy to feed. Another thing to look at as well is the number of feeds you're giving a day, because we obviously, for good feeding of horses, we don't want to feed more than about 2 kilos of concentrates in any one feed. And sometimes these horses just genuinely need more feed. So you then need to start looking at feeding them 3 or 4 times a day. And all those things together will help to get and keep condition back on your horses and ponies. So probably the most common query you get at this time of year is about the horse that's got a little bit too much energy, a bit too fizzy, and we're looking at trying to feed it so that it's still getting controlled energy for performance, for work that you're expecting it to do, but without being too mad. So we're basically looking at trying to feed as low a starch and as low a sugar a diet as you can get. Now this includes the grass. Again, we're back to the grass because there's rather a lot of it about, and at this time of year it's very high in sugar. So quite often one of the main things you can do is actually remove your horse and pony from the grass at certain times of the day at this time of year, but also making sure they're getting that forage through their system is the main thing to do. When it comes to the bucket feed, you try and keep it low starch, low sugar. So we're looking at pony nuts, conditioning cubes, and trying to avoid mixes, because mixes tend to be higher in starch, higher in sugar than horse and pony nuts and cubes would be. The other thing to do is basically look at feeding a balancer if even the horse and pony nuts and cubes are too much for your horse at this time of year. So if you use a balancer pellet and an appropriate chop, whether it be a lower spec chop or a higher spec chop depending on condition, then that is sometimes all that they need at this time of year. If it's a really good doer and the balancer is still too much for it, then the other thing you can do is use that lower calorie chop, but then use a good vitamin mineral supplement such as 1 scoop, along with your salt and things that we spoke about earlier. So basically, if you look at taking them off the grass when it's really, really high in sugar, giving them some time in the day off of the grass, using a low starch feed, whether it be horse and pony nuts or conditioning cubes, looking to use a balancer with a higher spec or a lower spec chop depending on condition. And if you use all those types of strategies, you should find that your horse and pony will be a little bit calmer for you at this time of year. The other opposite of your fizzy horse is your horse that's lacking a little bit in energy. Now this can happen any time of year, but it tends to happen sort of further through the competition series, or quite often horses just start to get a bit lethargic and start to feel like they're maybe struggling a bit with petrol in the tank. Sometimes you need to look at whether they're too hot. Sometimes some of these sort of more pony types or native crosses, it might be that you need to consider actually clipping them in the summertime as well, just to make them feel a bit cooler. When horses feel cooler, they're more inclined to want to exercise. The other simple thing you can do that is quite often a problem at this time of year is just make sure that your horse and pony is getting enough salt. So remember that's 2 tablespoons of salt a day, and then supplemented with electrolytes a day or 2 before a competition, during a hard competition weekend or training weekend, and then for a day afterwards. The thing to remember is that horses and ponies can't actually store electrolytes very well, so feeding it all the time isn't necessary, but you do need to make sure they're getting when they're actually working hard. The other thing that can help is just get someone to look and make sure that your horse and pony's vitamin and mineral requirements are actually being met. Quite often this is enough to actually give them back some of the energy. So if you're feeding, say, horse and pony nuts, but you're not feeding what the requirement is on the back of the bag, that basically means that you are not providing all the vitamins and minerals that they need. So you should top up with a good quality vitamin and mineral supplement such as 1 scoop. All of these things generally, in my experience, tend to do the trick. However, if that hasn't worked for you, the other strategy you can do is try switching to a coarse mix if your horse is currently on nuts or cubes, because that just gives them a bit more va-va-va-voom type energy, so fast response energy from the starch and the sugars that are in the coarse mixes. And for a good doer, obviously you don't want to be giving them coarse mixes because they then put on too much condition, and that in itself can lend them to become lethargic. So a fit, thinner horse and pony is going to be way more energetic than a fat one. So for the good doer, one of the tricks that you can try is giving it its normal diet, say it's a balancer plus a chop, but give it just a handful of a high energy course mix, such as a conditioning mix, just a handful every day. And then when you're getting close to a competition or a training session, you can up that handful to a couple of handfuls or a few handfuls, whatever works for your horse and pony, just for that window of a few days that you need them to have that extra energy. So you're giving them the handful to make sure that their gut bugs are accustomed to having that feed, and then you're increasing it a little bit just in time for your competition, and then obviously taking it away again once the competition is over. So all those tricks should hopefully help with your horse and pony giving them more energy. Obviously, if none of these work, then you need to start to look at if there is actually something that's being looked at by a vet. We would just always caution you to do that if you ever have any issues, or consult with a qualified nutritionist. Thank you for listening to us today. So hopefully that's given you some ideas of how to solve some of these common feeding issues that we see. Just remember though, all horses are individuals, so please do contact us with any queries via email or at our 21 stores throughout Scotland.